Hello and welcome to the No Ceilings NBA Draft Show. Today is a deep dives episode. I'm your host, Nick Agar Johnson, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Paige Otto. Paige, how are you doing this fine evening?
I'm doing great, Nick. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well. I've got a miserable travel day ahead of me tomorrow, but tonight I get to talk to you about basketball. So, it's much better than spending 6 hours on the road in traffic on I-5, which real California heads know how miserable I-5 can get. So, other than that, though, that's
For
tomorrow's
those in
stuff.
Michigan, you guys know how I-75 is during the holidays. It's the same
There's
thing
some
as
miserable
California.
interstate wherever you are. If you're in the U.S., I'm sure there is a miserable highway for our, Australian and other abroad listeners. For those of you in England, just take a train and shut up about it. I say this as a British citizen. I'm allowed to. Anyway, shall we move on to our two players for the day?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so we are going to start with your player for this episode, and you went with someone who has really blossomed on the scouting radar over the past couple of seasons, but has a bigger role than ever this year for Wisconsin, and that player, of course, is John Blackwell. So, Paige, why did you decide to go with John Blackwell for today's episode?
Yeah, I chose John Blackwell because of what you just mentioned. He's kind of been more of a forefront in terms of scouting wise this year. And for those of you that are going to be watching this, Wisconsin plays Central Michigan today, but Blackwell is out. Wisconsin just tweeted that he's out due to injury. Not really sure what that injury is, but something to just take note of for the following weeks. But John Blackwell, he's a 6'4", 194-pound junior guard. He's a type of prospect that I love his archetype. He's a scorer first. He's aggressive and confident, can score at all three levels in a variety of different sets. He can get to the free throw line with ease. He's a tough shot maker, can create his own shot off the dribble in isolation as well. Really great at getting to his spots. He's also a very active rebounder for his size, which I also like because, as we know, rebounding is one of the most translatable skills at the NBA level. And for him doing that at such an efficient rate is such a good sign for him due to him being a smaller guard. He's averaging 19.1 points per game, just under 5 rebounds, 1.6 assists, and on shooting splits of 38, 41, and 82 this year. Obviously, the 38% from the field isn't the best. And I think over the last 5 games, he's definitely struggled a lot, particularly at the rim. He's definitely shown that he does struggle with length, right, at the rim. But he's also, due to his confidence and his tough shot-making ability, he is able to score efficiently at the cup. But due to him, being very predictable in terms of his downhill drives, he drives almost 70% with his left hand compared to his right hand. So that definitely is very predictable, on the defensive end of the ball. And it definitely shows in all of his drives too. With him, I think what he struggles with is that when he kind of over dribbles a lot, and that creates a lot of his turnovers, and his playmaking has, he's not the most efficient, playmaker that you look for in a guard. He doesn't really have that plus assist to turnover ratio. A lot of his turnovers are definitely self-inflicted. His decision-making is definitely questionable. The last game they played at Villanova, he actually fouled out. He had 5 fouls. One of them was
It was an
actually
overtime game, to be fair.
it was an overtime game. Yes, you're right. But for one of your guards to fall out too, it's just, not a good sign. And most of those were self-inflicted, as I was saying. Like, he literally pushed one of Villanova's guys and, got called for the push-off. And he kind of was like, what was I doing? Like, he was kind of thrown off guard. It's like, it's kind of like, last night, it's like Amon-Ra, St. Brown from the Lions. Like, he literally pushed off, one of the Steelers defenders, and I got called for pass interference. And Lions fans like me were like, what the heck? Like, it's kind of like that, but it's like, dude, like, you know what you did.
My first instinct
But
was what I
yeah.
have grown used to this year. Sorry for interrupting, but my
No,
first
you're good.
instinct was someone who we talked about before we started recording today, of Russell Westbrook has one of the most entertaining "it wasn't me" faces I've ever seen on a basketball court. And if you are a fan of a team on which Russell Westbrook plays, you will get used to that face very quickly. It's the most hilariously incredulous. It's like, and it's usually after he like, and I have grown very fond of Russell Westbrook during his short Kings tenure, but it's usually on the most obvious foul possible that he's doing like, what? I didn't do anything. I didn't touch him. And you watch the replay and he's like, he punches the guy on the forearm. It's like, you can't do that. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're totally okay. You're totally okay. And with Blackwell too, part of the reason I chose him is that, he did declare for the draft last year, but his shooting efficiency, what makes him so intriguing for scouts, took a dip the last 9 games. He averaged just below 30%, but in that stretch too, he still scored 19 points per game, right? So even though his shot isn't falling, he's still, finding ways to impact, on and off the ball. And one thing I do want to notice is that he's awesome at getting to the free throw line. He has currently through 12 games has his highest free throw rate of his career so far at 52.3. Last year took a little bit of a dip at 32.4 in his freshman year, just about the same range as this year at 51.6. And he just has an open tab for drawing fouls because even though he is small, he's still strong and confident, and has a really great understanding of, breaking through contact, and, does a really good job of understanding angles to, better finish around the rim. But that goes to show too that a lot of his, attempts at the rim, he's currently, I believe, he's shooting under 40% at the rim this season. And that's kind of what I talked about, with him, kind of being a volume shooter, right? That efficiency definitely has to catch up. Because, if he's not going to be able to shoot the ball at a high clip, an efficient clip, and, he's struggling at the rim, but he also gets to the line. So it kind of, you kind of go back and forth of, what you value more. Obviously, with him being a smaller guard, him getting to the line as often as he does is definitely, very, plus in my eyes, right? But, when he isn't drawing fouls, he can't convert at the rim, which is also, a big concern of mine as well. So it's kind of, what can he rely on more if his shot isn't falling? And I definitely think there is questions. I think last year and the year before, he definitely settled a lot in the mid-range. And I think his shot diet has definitely evolved this year because he could definitely, let it fly from downtown, right? But, it's just his shot selection does need a little bit of work because I think he gets rushed at times. But also he is such a high usage offensive threat for Wisconsin. So he definitely is relied on a lot to score because he is a pure, score 2 guard, which is his role. But with him, I think selflessness will really go a long way this year in terms of his development for the NBA.
Yeah, so you mentioned him being out with injury for the game that's happening as we're recording this. And, I think it's also worth noting, given that we're not quite sure the nature of the injury at this point, over his past 5 games, he's shooting 13 of 41 from 2-point range. Yeah. And that to me encapsulates pretty much the whole problem, is how much of his pretty terrible shooting from 2-point range this season is due to injury, how much of it is due to, we're early enough in the season, the sample size is, at least double digits now, but it's still not, gigantic. And I think that sort of ties into a lot of the discussion here, which, as you mentioned, the free throw rate is very good and exceptionally important for the profile that he has. But, in terms of the shooting, you mentioned the green light he has. Yeah, dude has a green light, and
the greenness of light.
Not afraid. Yeah, and he is not afraid to turn that Christmas tree on and break all the red bulbs on the tree when he gets
I like
to
that one. I like that one, Nick.
Yeah, there you go. Jew making Christmas jokes. We've got it all. Hey, Hanukkah's over. I have to go to the Christian side now. Anyway, no, but with Blackwell, I think it's important to note, as you mentioned, that the shooting in terms of just the percentages took a downward tick the last few games of last season, but something that we've talked about a ton already and will continue to, because I am more and more convinced that it is, if not more important, at least as important, is the volume, right? I mean, he is shooting over 7 3-point attempts per game this year. And so the fact that he's hit 41% of those, again, for all the times that I have decried the Derek Williams principle, John Blackwell has already taken more 3-pointers this year than Derek Williams took that one college season where everybody thought he was going to be a shooter because he shot like 50%. And so, again, that is a huge part of the equation for me. And when you combine that with the fact that he has been staggeringly consistent from the free throw line, 82.1% his freshman year, 82.1% this season, and a slight dip down to 81.5% last season, right? You mentioned the free throw rate, which is one thing, but in terms of consistency from the line, he's up there. And, unlike some other players who we've talked about before, that's a positive number, right? He's not consistently at 50% from the line, unlike some other players that we may have talked about last time we podcasted. But I am curious for your thoughts on some of the other elements of his offensive game. I mean, you mentioned the assist to turnover ratio. He is technically negative for his college career, but I mean, it's basically flat. 120 assists, 122 turnovers, essentially 1-to-1. And that is something where, I'm not Maxwell. I'm not going to say that no small guard ever has a chance to make it in the NBA, but you have to do this is going to sound so stupid, but it's the best way I can think of to put it. You have to do a lot more as a 6'4" guard to stick around than, if he were 4 inches taller. All of a sudden, the requirements for being a forward are much lesser. The requirements for even being a wing are lesser in terms of, things you have to compensate for. And with Blackwell, the fact that he's as fantastic of a rebounder as he is, that makes a huge difference. The fact that, and granted, some of this is just because in those last 5 games, he also has 10 steals, which, is well above his career marks. But if he can keep that up in terms of the defensive playmaking, that's another huge step. And the fact that he's as stocky as he is, that's always something that I think is a plus, especially, when we're talking about guys who aren't, young freshmen who are going to go in the top 10, right? It's like, okay, if you're going to go, just throw a number out there. Let's say he's the 47th overall pick. Say he's the 48th overall pick, whatever. Let's, if he's in that kind of range, the fact that there is less development that he needs to be ready from a physical standpoint, that's a big plus. But again, the flip side of that is just, if you take, say his 2-point shooting numbers from last season, his 3-point shooting numbers from this season, that's an exceptional prospect, right? But the at rim stuff this year, it's concerning. I'm not as concerned about it as I might be about some other things, just because, again, they just announced that he went out with injury, and given that his last few games have been really bad from an offensive efficiency standpoint, it stands to reason that maybe him being hurt played into the fact that 2 games ago against Nebraska, he went 1 of 11 from the floor and 0 of 5 from 2-point range, right? So I'm not as worried about the at rim finishing, given that each of the last 2 seasons he was above 50% at the rim, right? So the fact that he's shooting 38% at the rim this season, I don't buy that as a long-term trend or anything. But the thing is that, given that he's struggling to score around the rim, it's great that he's hitting his threes at the rate that he is, but he needs to combine the two to, stick around at the NBA level, because, it's something that we talk about quite frequently. If you can be forced out of your best area or even your second best area on the floor and you don't have a counter, it's a lot easier to control your offensive game. And given that Blackwell is this kind of score first guard, the scoring part needs to not be a question, right? And so I'm not really worried about it, just because, again, the timing of the injury with the fact that he dipped like 20% in at rim percentage, like he was 58% last year, 38% this year. I'm willing to bet that that's not a long-term thing, but he can't shoot 32% like he did last year and, go where he would want to go in the NBA draft.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points with Blackwell.
Oh, and first time for everything.
Certainly don't. And I think certainly with, depending on what his injury is, obviously it's not disclosed yet. It might be, disclosed after the game tonight against Central Michigan. But I think that definitely, plays a factor of, his struggles from the Cup, last few games, especially it was on display with Villanova. And one of the things that, kind of really concerns me with him is that his processing ability and decision-making it's always kind of seems like it's like a step behind, really. Like he either tries to do too much or too little, or, makes a pass too late or too fast, or, it's always not where it needs to be. And I think with him being a smaller guard, score first guard, that if he doesn't have that processing ability down and can't even, have a positive assist to turn ratio, that's a problem. And it's always, and I think too, with the role he is, kind of engraved with Wisconsin, I think it doesn't, let him have a lot of leeway, which, definitely doesn't really help. But everyone knows that, he can score, right? He doesn't need to prove that. He needs to prove other things. And that, he needs to be a little bit more, selfless, right? In terms of, setting up his teammates. And, the past, 5 you mentioned, he had, 11 assists, right? Or 11 steals. And, I forget which game it was, but, he had 3 assists and only, 1 steal. And it's kind of like the past 5 games, it was kind of like three steals and like 1 assist. But, with him, a lot of his assists when, they do come are kind of, he self-creates so much and it's kind of like he gets stuck in a place or gets to a spot and, it's kind of like a last second he has to, quick, kick out to his teammates. It's not really like that's his plan going into it. And I think that's something he really needs to work on for the next level for him to, create a pathway to the NBA. But with him too, I think, I definitely think, the injury, whatever it is definitely bothering him to an extent. But I don't know, there's a lot of, you're making me think of like a lot of questions that I haven't like already asked myself about him. Because I was, excited coming into the season just based on like what we were hearing. I know Steven did a piece about him, I think earlier in the season, about some conversations he had about kind of the workouts he was doing, and kind of, extending his range, kind of getting out of the mid-range, right? He shot a lot of mid-range jumpers last year. But I think what works well for Blackwell is that, he's excellent off the catch. He's excellent isolation. He does have an efficient, dribble jumper. But one thing that does hold him back is that, he does too much in terms of trying to create and play make for his teammates. And, Wisconsin isn't, the best team this year. They're 8-4. They're not, they're not to an extent, they had a really great game against Nebraska last weekend. But Blackwell certainly didn't show up in that sense. He definitely seemed rushed in a lot of his possessions, couldn't really create into the way that he was playing earlier in the season. And I think as we go into conference play in the new year, you're definitely going to want him to, show that, right? Because, he already declared for the draft. He came back. This time is kind of like, what else more can you do? Obviously, his rebounding rate is awesome for a small guard. Definitely, he's a better defensive rebounder than offensive rebounder. He has no trouble, coming in off the glass, especially off his teammates' missed shot or his. He's a great closeout attacker. He loves to drive the baseline. And I think in terms of offensive processing, he's great at. But defensive processing, there's definitely, ways for him to go.
Yeah, that was my next question, is where you're at on the defense, because it's not awful. I don't want to oversell here, but it's also, again, it's one of those things to check so many boxes as a 6'4" guard in this era of the NBA, and he doesn't have the defense box checked and he doesn't have the passing box checked. And the fact that he is, I think, going to finish the year with a much better 2-point percentage than he has right now, it's exactly like you said, right? It's like everybody knows that he can score. That's not the question. The question is, and this honestly feels mean in both directions, but it's like, we're seeing this with Cam Thomas right now of, there wasn't exactly a long line of people, waiting to get Cam Thomas stock when he was in restricted free agency. And Cam Thomas has improved leaps and bounds as a passer, right? He's not the same player he was entering the NBA, where he was just a total black hole. But, for all that he genuinely has improved a lot as a playmaker for others, he's still a 6'3" guard who doesn't really care about defense. And, Blackwell's got a little bit of size on Cam Thomas, but not too much. And, for all that he is exceptional at scoring, he's not quite Cam Thomas level. So when you put all those things together, it's like, it's a very long uphill climb for that kind of player if they can't either get to the point where they're a serious plus passer or they're at least average defensively. And
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm willing to bet that him getting to average defensively is going to be easier than him figuring out a lot of the playmaking stuff. Because, especially
Hmm.
for off ball guards who, are score first and, in some cases score second and score third, it takes a while. Like, you watch the Devin Booker evolution up close, right? That's basically the best possible version of that. And,
Yeah.
there have been similar things. I mean, when Metcalf and I talked about this a few years ago, it was like Devin Booker and Zach LaVine were the examples that we held up of, hey, if you have an exceptional work ethic and you get a ton of developmental playing time at point guard because your team is so god awful that they'll just throw the young guy out there and say, hey, at least our future is Devin Booker, at least our future is Zach LaVine. We might as well, see what they look like with the ball in their hands. It's like that took a long time for either of them to get to a point where they were helpful as playmakers. And they were both lottery picks, right? For all that
Yeah.
they maybe fell further in the draft than some people might have thought they would, they were both the 13th overall pick. John Blackwell is not going to be the 13th overall pick. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe he finishes the season shooting 60% from three on 8 attempts per game and he goes 13th. Sure. Theoretically possible, right? But the idea being that Devin Booker and Zach LaVine were very heavily valued by their team, much more so than your typical number 13 overall pick. And that's still a lottery pick as opposed to a guy who, is probably going to be a second round pick. So the chances of him getting those kinds of on ball reps just seem a lot smaller to me. Whereas, hey, this is going to be the most obvious statement I've ever said on the podcast. If you're going to be one of the 5 players out there on the basketball court, you're probably going to be asked to play some defense. Most of the time, you're probably going to be asked to at least guard someone occasionally, right? So it's like the value proposition for, hey, John Blackwell, what should work on in the gym while you're sitting with this injury, however long it is, right? It's like, I think that working on his defensive fundamentals is going to be a lot more helpful to his future NBA career than the passing playmaking stuff. I do wonder, as I do with, many such players, I mean, a lot of the question is, will the effort be there? And the fact that
Hmm.
his steals rate has been much higher this season, that's a promising sign, especially since it's also come with an increased offensive load, right? Usually you see those things go in opposite directions where it's like the more offensive responsibility, the less guys tend to care about defense. That has not been the case for John Blackwell this year, which is an exceptionally encouraging sign in my mind. But there's a lot of room to improve, and he's going to need to if he's going to want to stick around for longer than like being an end of the bench guy for a couple seasons.
Yeah, and I think what he does have as a plus on the defensive end is his defensive rebounding rate is
Yes.
very high. It's 18.5%. He has that as a plus column because that kind of makes up for, his off ball defense, right, in a way. So that's definitely a plus for him. But as you mentioned, his process ability is still not there on that end. He does kind of, play. I would say, his footwork and his mobility is kind of in question too on the defensive end of the ball. He is athletic, but he's also not, a pop versatility, type of player, right? He's not going to jump out of the gym. He's not going to have, a crazy highlight reel that, you love to see out of, smaller guards, right? And, with Cam Thomas, before, the Nets kind of had this guard draft haul, past couple of years, they're still in the rebuilding stage, but they didn't really have a lot to work off of. Obviously they have MPJ now, but they're still rebuilding. And I think for John Blackwell to get an opportunity, you mentioned Zach LaVine, Devin Booker, they also had going for them their frame and size, where in today's day and age you're not gonna let a 6'4", less than 200-pound guard, be the forefront of your team and get as many offensive reps at point guard for what it's going to take for him to be a efficient and consistent playmaker. That's just not going to happen. So he's going to have to work out those kinks, right? So it's just going to be is he going to finish with what you said, an opportunity, if an opportunity rises for him in the upcoming few games, especially in conference play, is he going to rise to that opportunity? It's just a mindset too with him. And I think there's certainly, pluses in that area that you mentioned, but it's just going to, take time, I think, with him.
Yeah, I mean there are positive things to look forward to on the defensive end. On the offensive end, really it's just everything except the passing he has in there, and just putting it all together at the same time is going to be huge for, potential evaluation. But in terms of his skill set, I mean, again, other than being 6'4" and, not quite the Zach LaVine level athlete, which
Yeah.
possibly literally no one in the history of the NBA has been a Zach LaVine level athlete. So, that's not the worst comparison to fall short of. But yeah, again, it's just, there's a lot of processing stuff. I think you hit the nail on the head with, processing being the sort of the term to use for it, of on both ends of the floor. It's, I think, again, the defensive processing is going to be more relevant to his shorter term NBA hopes, certainly. And I would argue his longer term hopes as well, because, again, even as much as Cam Thomas has improved, as much as Devin Booker and Zach LaVine improved, Devin Booker was really the only one of those three who's ever been like starting at point guard, right? Like the other guys was
Yeah.
like, hey, we'll give Zach LaVine the ball and he'll run the offense because we don't have anybody else to do it. And technically, he'll be listed on the lineup card at point guard, but he's going to guard the other team's 2 or 3, right? He's not going to bring the ball up every time. He's not going to be asked to be the point guard. It's more just like, hey, figure out some stuff, right? And the bar for figure out some stuff is, I think, a decent amount higher than John Blackwell is currently clearing. But again,
Mhm.
all of this is talking about, like, establishing a longer term NBA career, right? It's like, if he's going to be a 6th or 7th or 8th man, and, given his offensive explosiveness, 6th man is reasonably well fitting role, I would think. He'll still need to be better defensively. That isn't to say that he can't be, a valuable piece in the right situation, because when you can put the ball in the basket like he can, especially in terms of, long range shooting, someone's going to be interested, right? The question is just how firm is the foundation for long term NBA success. And I think that developing, I mean, both defense and passing, but the defense in particular is going to be really important.
Yeah, I agree. I think, if you're gonna, you know, look at, would you rather him, have a trajectory in terms of his playmaking and creation or his defensive processing? I think you would kind of lean defensive processing, because he already has, a valuable skill set in defensive rebounding. So he has that one area that he doesn't necessarily have to work on. And I definitely would go that route for him. And I think that's one, aspect of his game that, he should focus on. And with that too, if you focus on that, the defensive playmaking will come. He's already getting a lot more steals that he's, gotten in the past. So that's definitely a plus in that area. So yeah, I'm excited to see how, this unfolds. Hopefully his injury isn't, too bad, and we can see him, play very, very soon. So hopefully he's not out for, games on end. But yeah, I'm excited to see what, John Blackwell has in store for the rest of the season.
All right. Shall we move on to player number 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so I decided to go with Dailyn Swain for this week, because after picking Dylan Mitchell last time, I had to pick the same player all over again. No, there are some very key differences in my mind between the two of them, and so we can start with some of that. Dailyn Swain just transferred to Texas, big transfer out of Xavier heading into the season. Tyler Recker has been a huge Dailyn Swain fan for, it feels like, a decade and a half now. So, I'm not one of those first on X player type of people in general, but certainly in this instance, I cannot pretend to have been the first draft person or even the first no ceilings person to be all in on Dailyn Swain. But the thing with Swain that is particularly a draw for me is this guy is an absolute menace in terms of getting to the basket in every possible situation. He gets the basket in the half court almost at will. He, his free throw rate isn't quite John Blackwell level, but it's quite solid. He's not, a Dylan Mitchell level athlete, but he's good, I would say. And again, all of this is like, by NBA comparison standards, right? It's like, yes, of course, every single one of these players is vastly more athletic than the average person walking down the street, right? But like, by NBA athleticism standards, I would say Dylan Mitchell is like 95th percentile. Dailyn Swain is maybe like 70th or something along
Yeah.
those lines. Like, he can get up, but he's not the craziest leaper. He gets out in transition constantly, but most of that is just him taking the initiative with getting out on the break rather than like, he will beat people in foot races sometimes, but it's not, again, it's not when you think of the, hyper athlete, Amen Thompson, Zach Levine, right? He's not quite at that level, but it's almost more impressive to me that he's as insanely efficient around the basket as he is, despite being, again, a good athlete and very, very good by college standards. But, by NBA standards, I think it would be unfair to say he's likely to be more than like strictly above average, right? 70th percentile. But,
Yeah.
he is finishing almost 70% around the rim this season, which is insane. He has 11 dunks already, which, is quite a solid number given that he's 12 games into the season. And, he also had 24 dunks last year in, fewer minutes for Xavier than he's playing this year. Again, just absolute force when it comes to getting downhill, when it comes to attacking the basket. I don't think I'm going to do better than this number for describing the Dailyn Swain experience. He is currently shooting 65% on his 2-pointers on 8 of them a game. 8 a game, 65%. Here's the problem. He's shooting 56% from the field because he's shooting 28.6% from 3-point range. And, again, this is why I made the joke about just doing the Dillon Mitchell thing all over again. But there is a very, very, very important difference in my mind, which is Dailyn Swain is an 80% free throw shooter in college. And I've talked about it before. I am certain I will talk about it again because of the relative sample sizes and because of the variance in those respective statistics. Free throw percentage has consistently, and I have not recently refreshed the numbers, though, given the longer term No Ceilings project that I'm working on that we've talked about before, I probably should update my priors on that. But either way, the point being, free throw percentage tends to track a lot more closely to NBA 3-point percentage than college 3-point percentage because you can get wild swings of variance in a season from the 3-point line, but it doesn't take all that many attempts for an 80% free throw shooter to distinguish themselves from a 50% free throw shooter. So that is really, to be entirely honest, the only reason that I'm positive on Swain's. Well, no, there are 2 reasons why I'm positive on Swain's shooting development. The first is the free throw percentage, and that's by far the biggest. The second is that he's actually trying to shoot threes this year, and it hasn't been pretty, but he's already taken as many 3-pointers as he took all of last season at Xavier, and he's hit one more. So, hey, progress, improvement. But, the idea being, as I've said many, many times, and again, we'll probably say many, many times going forward, volume is a huge part of the process when it comes to evaluating a prospect as a 3-point shooter, not just in terms of, hey, the bigger the sample size, the more likely you are to have an actually useful number there, but even just on a sort of more personal psychological kind of level, right? It's a show of confidence. It's a show of, okay, I feel like I've worked enough on my shot that I'm going to take 2.5 threes a game. And the fact that he's hitting 28% of them, it's not good. The fact that he's already taken as many as he took last season is a huge step forward. And the fact that he's shooting 75% from the free throw line this year as opposed to his 80% mark for his college career, I'm not too bothered by it. I mean, first of all, again, in comparison to Dillon Mitchell, Dillon Mitchell would love to shoot 75% from the free throw line. But, the concept there, right, is very much the same of, okay, there are plenty of touch indicators that say, 1, this guy has touch, and 2, he's moving in the right direction with his shot, right? And so would it be nice if he was taking 3-pointers a game and hitting 35% of them? Yeah, that would make things a lot easier in terms of the evaluation, right? But in terms of everything else, I mean, he's taken a lot more on-ball responsibility this year, and he's always been an efficient passer, but he's been much more effective as a passer this year than I think he was at Xavier last year, not just, again, we've talked about it before, the difference between sort of making the simple reads, keeping the ball moving, et cetera, versus, Swain's efficiency in terms of offensive percentile. Like he's 78th percentile offensively overall. That goes up to 85th percentile when you include possessions plus assists. He's someone who, again, his assist to turnover ratio has always been positive, but this year, it's a similar conversation, right? He's upping the volume. He has the ball in his hands a lot more, and the results have been positive. The only offensive indicator that, hasn't gone up dramatically this season is the 3-point percentage, and that's still trending in the right, well, and the free throw percentage dipping slightly, but like the 3-point percentage is trending in the right direction, not the percentage, but the 3-point shooting, right? In terms of his willingness to take those shots. And so I'm curious sort of where you're at with Dailyn Swain, because the weakness is glaring and obvious, but I think it's trending in the right direction. And there are a whole lot of other positives in the rest of his game.
Yeah, I think one particular game that, stands out to me is the Duke game. He was switched. Cam Boozer was switched a lot on to Swain, and there's a few 3-point attempts that he took over Cam Boozer, but he looked super confident doing it. He had no problem, letting it fly, and I think since he does have such a great handle and great processing ability, due to his frame and size, he's 6'8", over 220 pounds, he's able to create a lot of space for himself, as a forward. You mentioned, obviously he's a standout defensive prospect. He can guard 1 through 4, right? But that game really stood out to me because, if you're looking at his film last year with Xavier, right, he wasn't as confident as a shooter. And for him to, kind of go out guns a-blazing, against a really elite Duke team, with arguably the top prospect in the 2026 NBA draft, and, basically size, Cam Boozer up is definitely a plus sign in that area that, obviously all of us know that he lacks. But one thing you also mentioned, is his, ability and consistency in transition. In the times that he has transitioned, 57% of the time, he's actually the ball handler. And with him, being such a plus size forward, that's such a great sign in terms of the modern NBA that, he can create for himself. He can definitely, size up defenses, and obviously can take it coast to coast as well too. But he can also stretch the floor and be patient. And his playmaking has certainly evolved over the years too. This year, let me see where it's at. I had something. Yeah, he has 41 assists to 27 turnovers. He's definitely a reliable playmaker. And, with him, if you compare, John Blackwell and, Dailyn Swain, one thing certainly stands out. Obviously, totally complete positions, but, if John Blackwell could have, Dailyn Swain's processing ability, if John Blackwell could have, Dailyn Swain's finishing ability, you're getting, potential lottery picks in both of them, right?
It's like one of those things where it's like the really super tall buff guy and the incredibly smart, attractive woman is like, man, if we had kids and they had your brains and my brawn, it's like, what if they have my brawn and your brains? Then they're screwed. So it's like whoever, like John Swain is a lottery pick, and Dailyn Blackwell is like, Dailyn Blackwell is like getting cut from the middle school team.
Yeah, it's like the Frankenstein episode, that Rucker and Metcalf usually do, right? They pick pieces of prospects. It's a super fun exercise, but obviously it's not reality. Sadly, as fun as, it is to, do all that stuff. But I think with Dailyn Swain too, you mentioned that, as a playmaker, he's also exceptional as a defensive playmaker too. He has a 2.9% steal percentage. He's also 0% assisted in the mid-range too. So that also tells me, he's great at, self-creation and in isolation, especially when he gets kicked out of the perimeter. I think this year too, he's definitely taken, in his offseason workouts to get better at, right? When he is, kicked out on the perimeter, he has no, he doesn't have any trouble, taking it on the deck or, getting that triple threat position and, taking his defenders, off with his first step, because he is, a very, very solid athlete. You mentioned 70th percentile. I would definitely say he's in that range, athletic wise. And I think with him too, because he is such a standout, defensive prospect, he has the frame, he has the feel, he has the motor that, definitely catches your eye right away. But he also has, that ball handling that when you're looking at this type of prospect, you're kind of worried about, right? Like with Dillon Mitchell, he didn't really, evolve in that sense until this year that we kind of saw. But with him already doing it and having such a big impact with Texas, it's definitely a great sign. And with him, being one of the primary ball handlers in transition, it tells me that, he is really reliable, with the ball in his hands. And, I definitely like that, he has a few moves. I wouldn't say he's, great at, being predictable, right? He can go between the legs. He can go in and out. He can do spin moves. He definitely has an offensive bag there. But you're not going to want him to do, much other than that. You're not going to want him to take, so many dribbles, because that's just not, the type of role that he's going to play in. But I definitely think that he has definitely a more, viceable archetype that the NBA, kind of like beelines for, right? Other than John Blackwell, because he can add so many other things. But he also has, improved as a scorer as well. He's averaging 15.1 points per game, 6.6 rebounds, 3.4 assists. And obviously you mentioned the shooting splits, and you mentioned, per 100 possessions, he's shooting 65% off twos at 15.7 attempts per 100 possessions, which is crazy for his, archetype. So I definitely he has a lot of pros in that column. And, it's kind of like, you get rid of Dillon Mitchell, but you get, Dailyn Swain, right, when it comes to Texas.
There you go. You mentioned the mid-range shooting, and I think that's really important to circle back to. So, sample size is still pretty small, although it's above 30, so it's not, it is at least somewhat statistically significant. And he's in the 63rd percentile as a spot-up shooter this season. That is almost exclusively driven by his efficiency in the mid-range because, again, we already cited the three-point shooting numbers. But in terms of, you mentioned the ways he's going to be used at the next level. And that I think is, exceptionally important to highlight is we talked about the transition stuff. We talked about the ball handling and running pick and roll, which has been his most frequent play type each of the last 2 seasons is as the pick and roll ball handler. But, the other things that he does, I mean, yeah, most NBA teams aren't going to ask you to spot up for mid-range jumpers, right? But, the flip side of that is he's going to get a lot more defensive attention this year than he would at his theoretical next NBA stop, right? And so that's where, the sort of off-ball stuff kind of comes more into play, where the fact that he's, stop me if you've heard this from me before, because I know you have, but he's a great cutter. That's, always something that I look for in a prospect. And the fact that, again, the spot up numbers look good, driven pretty strongly by him being incredibly efficient as a mid-range shooter. But it's one of those things where, something else I've talked to death about on this here podcast is watching Brook Lopez's development as a shooter. Development in air quotes, because really what it was is he was one of the best 18 to 20 foot mid-range shooters in the league. He was consistently like 83% from the free throw line. And then, 1 year Milwaukee said, hey, why don't you take like one of your big 7'1" steps backwards and just shoot those 20 footers from 24 feet. And all of a sudden they're worth 50% more points when you hit them. Right. And so like, that's one of those things where when I see a prospect like Dailyn Swain, who, yeah, the 3-point shooting number, it's not pretty. The fact that the confidence is growing this year is a really positive sign. The fact that his spot up numbers are also better than they were last year, despite the fact that he's not hitting threes, is a really positive sign. And the fact that he's as good of a free throw shooter as he is a really positive sign, right? It's not like you have to hope for so much with Dillon Mitchell figuring out any sort of touch. And it's easy to see why that's a problem when you look at the free throw shooting numbers, right? With Dailyn Swain, it's like, okay, so he's got the touch. He's clearly got, the sort of right feel for things. And as his confidence grows more and more, I would expect that, over time, say 3 years from now, if he can be, a 63rd percentile shooter from 3-point range as opposed to just from mid range, then all the rest of this stuff is like, it plays up, right? It's like, okay, you have to, there's this one hole in your game where if you tighten it up a little bit, everything that you do really well gets to shine, right? And with Dailyn Swain, it's like, okay, you need to get your way onto the court offensively because it's going to be very easy for any coach to look at him and say, wow, this 6'8" guy who's really athletic and tries hard and, makes effort plays defensively. Yeah, I think he can help our defense. And so then it's just a matter of, okay, can you do enough on the other end, right? It's sort of the reverse of the John Blackwell thing, except, in this particular case, it's a less nebulous hole, I think is the best way of putting it, right? It's like with John Blackwell, it's like, okay, maybe he improves as a point of attack guy, or maybe he bulks up a little bit and he's not quite quick enough to deal with point guards, but you can throw him on wings as a Lou Dort type, right? And obviously Lou Dort is a ridiculously high bar, but that concept, right? 6'3", built like a fire hydrant, can guard wings in addition to point guards, maybe not the quickest point guards, but can cover 2 through 4 relatively effectively. with Dailyn Swain, it's like the hole is very clear, it's very specific, and if he can fix it, then like if he can fix the shooting, then he goes into more of a Yaxel Lendeborg camp of like, what does this guy not do? Right? You mentioned
Mm-hmm.
the rebounding. It's not as against archetype because he's a forward. He's not a 6'4" guard like John Blackwell, and their rebounding numbers are actually pretty similar, which says a lot in the positive column about John Blackwell. But in terms of the offensive stuff, I mean, he doesn't have a, Darius Garland, Kyrie Irving, name who you want to name kind of handle, but he's more than good enough for his size. And the passing, playmaking stuff, he has consistently been an efficient playmaker in terms of not turning the ball over. This year, he's, actually creating plays for others at a rate that he really hasn't before. And so then it goes, again, the Dylan Mitchell joke exists in this podcast because it's the same hole, right? It's the same deficiency. The only difference in my mind, at least, is I mean, well, two differences. First of all, Swain is 2 inches shorter and significantly less athletic. That's the downside. The upside is there's cause for hope with Dailyn Swain as a 3-point shooter. And I say 3-point shooter specifically because he's already got the mid range stuff, right? But there are reasons to believe that, okay, as he continues to increase in confidence, we can see that in the volume that he's continuing to shoot more. And as long as, he gets to a place where, again, because the rest of his game is so solidified, it's like he doesn't need to be a good shooter. He doesn't even need to be an average shooter. He just needs to be like slightly below average. And right now he's far below average. So then the question is, okay, the list of prospects who people said if only he can figure out the shot is longer than it is for pretty much any other list of prospects that you can come up with. But it's not as far-fetched a case as like if Dylan Mitchell figures out how to shoot tomorrow, that will be a Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever festival you might celebrate. It'll be some kind of miracle, right? With
Yeah.
Dailyn Swain, it's like it's not likely, especially to happen on like a quick timeline. But just over the course of his college career, he's gone from 15% his freshman year, he took 26 threes total, to 25% his sophomore year, he took 28 threes total. And then this year, where, again, he's already matched his total from last year in terms of volume. If we get to the end of the year and Dailyn Swain is shooting 35% from 3-point range, he might sneak into the back part of the first round. If we get to the end of the year and Dailyn Swain is shooting 21% from 3-point range, he might go back to school for another year. And part of the evaluation problem is I genuinely think either of those possibilities could come to pass. But it's not going to be, like Dylan Mitchell, where it's like, hey, as soon as you hit a three, that will, significantly increase the volume of threes you hit over the course of your college career.
Yeah, I think with, Dailyn Swain too, it's more likely that, he's not going to be a shooter, right? But he's going to have traits that, he can definitely extend to that range. You mentioned he's shooting, just a little over 2, 3-point attempts per game, where, if you're looking at him last year or his freshman year, you're going to be like, that's possible. Like, what? But also that's probably, he came to Texas too. He's in, a different role, right? He's more, his usage rate is up, he's making, he's doing a lot more, on a bigger stage too with Texas as opposed to, Xavier being in the SEC. But I think with him too, his selling traits as a prospect is that, he's a Swiss Army knife, right? He can do a little bit of everything. And if, for lack of a better term, is that, the shooting is not dead for him, right? There's nothing that is like, he's hopeless, he's never going to be a shooter. But his free throw rate, he's shooting just under, 80%. He's exceptional in the mid range. There's qualities and traits that are pointing to that direction. It's just a matter of, can he, just step it out a little bit more? And I think because he is, he plays with confidence. He's also a risk taker too. You can see it, in his steal rate. I think, with his game, I don't think that's going to be a problem of us, just asking a little bit more, from a volume sense, from the 3-point line. But I think with him too is that there's you mentioned, if we get to the end of the season before the draft, he's shooting 35% at, 4 attempts per game. He could probably sneak in to the first round or even, a little bit before that, right? But traits and qualities that we've seen for him, as a freshman and a sophomore, it's also worth mentioning too, he's only 20 years old as a junior too. So he's a little bit, on the younger side. So he definitely has that going for him too. It's not like, he's like a 23-year-old, redshirt junior or anything. So that's definitely, a pro in his column. But I think with him too, that if you're comparing, Blackwell's, NBA, avenue and Dailyn Swain's avenue, I would definitely say, Swain has more, of a positive outlook just in terms of, what NBA teams value and what he brings to the table. And he can definitely affect the game in multitudes of different ways. And with his trajectory, he's definitely gotten better at, what needs to be, done for him. One thing I did want to mention is that, let me see here, where did it go? Is that, he's played more minutes than he ever has as well. I'm not sure if you said that or not, but, his first season, he averaged just a little bit under 5 points per game in under 19 minutes. And his sophomore season last year, 11 points in 26 minutes. So, obviously he's playing the same amount of minutes as his sophomore year, but he's also, doing a lot. He's basically a stat stuffer type of prospect, every game. He has struggled a little bit with higher end competition this year. His Connecticut game wasn't his best. He's definitely, had better games against, not top 100 teams, right? But there's a lot going for him. And I think one of the best traits that a forward of his archetype can have is that he is a reliable ball handler and is not afraid to put himself in, positions where he might fail, right? Because I was actually surprised looking at his tape is that most of his assists too do come from him being in transition. So that's also a plus too for his archetype, because he is, advancing as a playmaker year after year and, improving that skill set because the NBA is such, a fast game compared to college. I mean, for those that, watch the NBA Cup with the Spurs and Knicks, the pace that they were playing at, was insane. I mean, Seven Castle, obviously, he's grown as a playmaker too. He had 11 assists in the first half. Totally different prospects, but just had to point that out in terms of, playmaking trajectory because Castle obviously is, great on the defensive end as well. But I think there's a lot of, avenues that Dailyn Swain can go. But I think for him, it's mostly a positive outlook because there are so many indicators of what he's not good at, which is his shooting.
So I really do want to get back to that point in just a moment. I will note, as we mentioned up top, John Blackwell is not playing in Wisconsin's game tonight. Dailyn Swain is playing in Texas's game against Maryland Eastern Shore. And okay. I mean, 6 points, 2 of 5 shooting. He's missed his only 3, which is unfortunate, but he's made both his free throws, so that's nice. He also has 2 steals and a block. So, with time
Swiss
to go.
Army knife.
There you go. Time to go in the second half. So, the fact that Jordan Pope has 16 and Tremont Mark has 13 and, he doesn't need to score tonight. That's my story and I'm sticking with it. But I do want to go back to the avenues to playing time thing because it reminds me a lot of the discussion we had earlier this year about Janai Mobley versus Donovan Den. And I think the quickest way I can summarize it anyway is I think the 95th percentile outcome for John Blackwell is better because given how he can put the ball in the basket, if everything works out for him, that kind of player can be, I mentioned Darius Garland earlier, right? He can be that kind of, fringe all-star guard, scoring guard type, right? I think that's in the cards for him. I think the 50th percentile outcome for Dailyn Swain is more likely to be a long-term NBA player than it is for John Blackwell. And that's essentially where we sat at the end of the Janai Mobley, Donovan Den conversation of, hey, if absolutely everything works out, Janai Mobley is such a special shooter that he could be that kind of primary scorer on a team type, right? And that is a whole lot of the confusion around evaluating the draft in general, right? Is just, hey, what are the chances that this guy, hits a middle of the road outcome? What are the chances that things go wrong and maybe he doesn't turn out as well in the NBA as he did in college or, the Turkish league or wherever his previous stop was, right? And it's the kind of thing where I think it's very different if you're looking at someone who's likely to be a top 10 pick versus, the vast majority of the players we're talking about here on deep dives are guys who are going to be second round picks, right? And so for for me, I'm starting, and this is not a new thing, but starting to think more and more about how quick turnaround times are for second round picks, by which I mean, like, if you don't show something in year one as a second round pick, you're liable to be part of the roster churn in year two. You don't even have to be a second round pick. Undrafted guys are going that route, right? Where it's like, either you prove that you have something that you can hack it at the NBA level with, and then you get signed to another deal, or you don't, and you're going to the NBL, or you're going to, play for Partizan Belgrade, or wherever you end up next, right? And so I'm increasingly thinking that looking at the 50th percentile outcome is more and more important for second round picks, because it kind of needs to be a perfect match of player and team situation for a guy picked in that range to establish himself on that team. And, there are a lot of second draft guys. We talk about that all the time of, hey, maybe spot number one didn't work out for this guy, but, for whatever reason, maybe he didn't get along with the coach. Maybe, he was, Minnesota kid, and all of a sudden he's in New Orleans and he doesn't know what to do with himself, right? It's like there could be 7,000 different reasons. But ultimately, if you can't, show whoever the coach and or front office and or ownership is that, no, actually, I'm worth keeping around, I'm worth, developing for the longer term, there's a whole lot of, but what have you done for me lately? And, if there's something that you need to improve on at the NBA level, this has always been true, but it feels even more true now than it did even 5 years ago. If you're a top 10 pick, you'll get the latitude to make mistakes in a way that if you're a second round guy, you really won't.
Yeah. And I think, part of, kind of the question and statement that you're making too is that, there's higher sense of the word of, the highest ceiling in the second round. What would you rather take a risk on? And if you're looking at, Dailyn Swain and John Blackwell, personally, I think Dailyn Swain could have the higher ceiling in
Interesting.
terms
Okay.
of Blackwell, because I think I value more aspects of his game than I do Blackwell, because I kind of lean more towards the players that can do a little bit of everything, can play make for others, can defend, can be a great connecting piece in the NBA, because as we've seen, with this trend that, if you don't have solid glue guys around you, you're not really going to be, a championship contender. You're going to kind of fall short. The Suns example, right? Obviously, we gave up a lot to get Kevin Durant and let a lot of our glue guys go. Cam Johnson, Mikal Bridges. The list goes on and on. And we kind of, fell short year after year because, we wanted these high level scorers that, we could rely on. Obviously, we got rid of Bradley Beal. So I think the turnaround rate for, pure scorers, especially if you're a smaller guard, is a lot higher than, a 6'7", 225-pound Swiss Army knife that, has shooting, traits that Dailyn Swain has. So that's just my thought process in terms of that. I'd be interested, what the audience thinks as well, who could have, who would have the most reliable ceiling, Blackwell or Swain. But I definitely lean Swain in that regard, just of, aspects of that I value.
Well, as the first member of the audience listening to that, I couldn't agree more. And I think it goes back to when people talk about, the increasing prevalence of 5-out systems,
Mm-hmm.
it's purely in terms of shooting. And that's just not how basketball works. Like, if you're running out, and I hate to do this to my guy, Nate Biddle, but, it's like, well, he can pass enough that it's not really fair. But, the concept being, hey, if all you're including in the 5-out portion, in the 5 portion of 5-out is, can you shoot? Then, it's not going to work, right? As you mentioned, you need those connective pieces. Like, okay, if we've got, our big man in the post backing someone down and there are 3 open shooters, but he can't pass it all, so he can't hit those shooters. It's like, early career Joel Embiid was a real experience in terms of like, just teams would swarm him in the post and he wasn't good enough at kickouts yet to know what to do. And so he just had these astronomical turnover rates. And as he figured out, how to shoot, that's how we go from, man, this Joel Embiid guy has promised, to, okay, Joel Embiid is winning an MVP. And you can argue with, whether he should have won that MVP or not. But the point being, you don't win an MVP without being close enough in consideration to get votes for MVP, right? And if Joel Embiid never figured out how to pass out of the post, he would never have been MVP. And, that's obviously a very high line example of the concept here. But the idea being, if all you're looking at for 5 out is just, can you shoot or not? That's not the right way of looking at it. The right way of looking at it is, and this is an easy example to go to, but the Oklahoma City method of, hey, everybody needs to be able to dribble, pass, shoot, and defend. Everything else we can figure out. But as long as everybody on the floor can hit one of those 4 traits, we're golden. And, they've taken risks on guys who needed to figure out a few of those. And, Ousmane Dieng, Hamidou Diallo, those guys haven't quite panned out. Whereas, players who, Jalen Williams was the pick directly after Ousmane Dieng, right? I wonder who's more valued around the NBA at this point in time. Shout out to friend of the program, Jalen Williams. The idea being, again, with the sort of advent of quote unquote positionless basketball, the part that isn't, quote unquote positionless is there are certain skill sets that every team needs on the floor, right? Everybody needs someone to bring the ball up. The flip side, everybody needs someone to guard the point of attack guy. Everybody needs a backline defender. Everybody needs somebody who can be switchable. Everybody needs at least 3 shooters. Most teams tend to prefer 4. Some teams will refuse to do anything other than 5, right? But that's the idea, is rather than just, okay, this is our 6'10" guy, therefore he's our power forward, the evolution of the NBA beyond that hasn't eliminated the need for entry passes, right? It's just eliminated the need for the guy throwing the entry pass must be 6'2" and must have more assists than points because he's a point guard. Right? It's like, as the game evolves, and I think it's a wonderful thing the game is evolving in that way, but what it essentially means is, going back to one of the first things I said when we were talking about Blackwell, you have to check a lot of boxes. And I'm not sure genuinely on the ceiling question, because that goes back to my 95th percentile outcome thing from before. But in terms of sort of middle of the road, like, if both of these players stay as they are now, assuming Blackwell recovers from his injury, obviously, right? Like, if they are fully healthy, but essentially as they are now, I would be more willing to bet on Dailyn Swain's future career. I think there are a few teams that need a John Blackwell more than they need a Dailyn Swain, and those are just teams that are terrible offensively. Mm-hmm. But the number of teams that could use Dailyn Swain is almost everybody. And if you can figure out how to shoot, then it's literally everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think, we value, a lot of the same skill set and archetypes and players. And I think, if Blackwell was, 2 to 3 inches taller, we would be having a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
But it's just not the fact. He is only 6'4". Haven't seen him play in person, but that looks to be about right. Especially with, his stocky build too. It's kind of hard, when you're watching film and not, getting to see some players in person, if they are actually, what they are listed at, on the team's website. But he does look, every bit of 6'4" and 194 pounds. But yeah, I think with Swain too, that, why wouldn't any team, want a guy that can do all that he can get and have a value of him, as a second round, right? And with Blackwell too, I think, if it came down to, team could either pick Blackwell or Swain at, 54, 53, whatever the case be. I think a majority of them, if not all, would definitely go, to Swain route, because I think he has, long-term outcome. And I definitely think he has more potential to hit, that second contract in the NBA level than Blackwell, just of, what we've seen with them in college.
Well, you said 53 and I said 48. So clearly I'm much higher on these guys than you are.
This first number that came in my head.
There you go. All right. Shall we move on to some quick hits and then wrap this up?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So you had a much better idea than mine for this, which was you had an idea and I didn't. So why don't you take the lead here?
Yeah. So obviously this is our last episode before the holidays are later this week. So wanted to,
Hey, for some of us, the holidays are over.
Yeah. Yes. For those that, celebrate Christmas this week and obviously NBA Christmas, one of the best days in NBA basketball. I think I wanted to do something a little bit more different than just, talking about some of the games that are on before, we come back after the holidays. So one of mine was, and for those that are listening too, feel free to comment on YouTube with your response to this as well. But what was your favorite memory growing up of anything sport related that had to do with Christmas, Nick?
So I think I've told this story before, but I got into basketball a little bit later than many people, by which I mean, I was still a kid, but, in high school as opposed to, from the very beginnings of life. And
Mm-hmm.
as we have talked about to death, to the point of our listeners being maybe annoyed at this point, baseball was my thing growing up. So I didn't really start getting into the NBA until I was a teenager. But the one holiday season related thing that always sticks with me about the NBA was I loved the Jingle Bells commercials. It was so easy, it was so simple, and it was perfect. It was like, for we don't need to get into the rant of how commercial quality appears to have declined, and I don't know if that's because I'm a 97-year-old man at this point on the inside, or if that's just actually lessening in quality, but just something about that Jingle Bells shooting commercial, just it always sticks with me as, oh, this is really easy to do and really fun, and hey, this was cool that this happened. If I'm going to be watching a commercial right now, I would very much like it to be this commercial because it's fun and on theme, and also, we get to watch LeBron throw down a dunk from Steph Curry to wrap things up. That was Steph Curry on the lob, right? I'm not misremembering this. I could be. It's 12 years old at this point.
I don't think so. Yeah, true. No, I think you're right. Yeah. One of my favorite holiday, things that the NBA did was when Kobe, KD, and LeBron released Christmas edition shoes every year, and then obviously they would wear them on Christmas Day. And that you could buy the set, or you could buy, each one individually. And me being in high school at the time, and 2013, or before that, obviously younger, but I was like obsessed. I think every person has like gone through like their Nike Elite sock obsession, and they would release like Christmas socks too, so like I would get those, and then I would like beg my parents to at least buy like one of the pairs of the Christmas shoes for Christmas, because I would play basketball in high school and I wanted to wear them, but like I would be like whole decked out, and like some people like in my school too would like wear them as like their everyday shoe. Like it was a whole like frenzy. But that's one of my favorite memories. I wish they could bring it back. Maybe they will, because I think a lot of people miss them, and everything I see on Instagram and TikTok with like nostalgic or like late night finds, has some sense of like old holiday commercials on there.
I can't pretend that this is a generational thing at all, because the other sneakerheads at No Stealings are older than me, but it's really funny to hear you talking about that era, because my youngest brother is not like a big sneakerhead, but like, definitely actually knows a lot more than I do when it comes to that stuff. And it's I don't know, it's funny to me. I was I will not reveal too much, but I will say that I was not in high school in 2013, and so that made me feel exceptionally old. So thank you very much for that.
That was not my intentions.
For those of you who listen to the other podcast that I co-host, the Kings Weekly podcast with Ray LeBeau of Basketball Intelligence, I'm getting all my old man jokes out now, because as soon as I hop on the pod with Ray, and he's legitimately an older gentleman, is like, I can't make these jokes anymore. I gotta get these jokes off where I can. All right.
You got to be more Gen Z, Nick. Come on.
I've tried. I don't need to say anything more than I've tried. How do I reach these kids, Paige? How do I reach these kids?
I mean, I don't even know anymore.
Fair enough. All right. I don't think we can end on a better note than that, but just in case, is there anything else before we wrap this one up?
No, all good here.
All right. Well, happy holidays from all of us at No Ceilings to all of you out there in the world, whatever you may be celebrating or not in the coming days. If you've been enjoying the show, you can find us on YouTube, No Ceilings TV, No Ceilings NBA on all social platforms. You can find Paige at PaigeAuto_ on social media. You can find me at NBA Johnson. If you've been enjoying the show, please take the time to leave a rating and or a review in whatever podcast player or video app you may be using. That's always much appreciated on our end. And if you have any feedback regarding the deep dives portion of the podcast specifically, feel free to reach out to either of us via social media or me via email, nickaj.nba@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.